Welcome to the world building session. I'm actually diving back into one of the things I was working on last time. I just enjoyed it. I sat down for just a few minutes on this cold winter's day and worked a little bit more on these two at the top. And I decided, kind of for the general topic today, that what I wanted to pontificate about is making a group of people believable. And the idea here stems from something we talked about last time, which is essentially the fact that having variance within a theme is going to be a really beneficial thing. I've got these, different structures, and I talked about this being a region where there are really strong prevailing winds and what that, how that has determined how the people live there, the kinds of things that they build, the structures that they have to, put together. And that gave me a good starting point for how things might look. But when I listed out a whole bunch of the cities and towns in this region and created a couple new ones, these down here, because I had forgotten about these two, had to go back through some old chapters and look at things in order to figure out what all I had done and what I hadn't done. It became really evident to me that I need to have some subtle variations in all these different people groups, and that will, inevitably make things look a little bit more realistic, right? Because if you have a group of people who live in a particular region, they are not all going to choose to solve problems the same way. Now, it seems reasonable to me that, Elaine here is the capital city. I don't know off the top of my head right now whether it always was the capital city or whether in the past there were some, was another city that carried on that role. I'm not 100% sure. At some point, I'll sit down and do some more world building writing and actually establish those kinds of things. But for now, I'm not 100% positive. And you don't need to have all of those details when you sit down to put something together the first time. Right now, as I'm kind of talking through this, what I'm working on is I'm just sketching out some basic shapes. This is one of my preferred ways to world build and to work on designing things, is not to overthink it. I've got two paths here. One is I will sit down and make a detailed list of all the things and pieces that a particular thing needs to have in order to, serve the purpose that it needs in the story. Sometimes that is the best option, especially if something really has a critical role to play, if it needs to fit some specific design requirements. And there is the most of the time, which is I do what I'm doing right now, which is I just sketch out a bunch of things and start working on refining ideas. Because when I'm loose like this, I will often create things that I didn't intend because I'm just slapping shapes down quickly. And I find that is a really successful way for me to do this. You might have different results, and that's understandable. We're all a little bit different in how we approach these things. And I find that I don't do this very much if I don't have to. In fact, I'm going to take this one right here because most of these have this idea of stone being the bottom and then going up into almost like brick of some kind. And I immediately just had the idea of what if you had a region that was much more stony and rocky, and they had the ability to actually just build the whole house out of stone. So the whole point here is essentially I have a theme. The theme is these are people who live on a steppe, not particularly unlike the high plains here in Colorado or Mongolia with their high plains. And there's not a lot of trees, so that limits the use of wood in most of their building materials. And they have very strong prevailing winds. The weather is not, crazy, but also is, pretty intense in winter, or at least can be, kind of like Wyoming, but not quite as high at elevation. And all of those things then inform basic decisions. The decisions that I talked about last time essentially we are going to have structures that are built to take the wind, and they're going to be sloped and asymmetrical, largely just because I find that intriguing. Like, that's just an interesting way to do things. I, at least in my general sketching, have a tendency to make things symmetrical. It's how I process. It's the graphic designer brain coming out. And so it's fun to think about what that would be like if that wasn't the case. If things didn't have to be symmetrical, how would they change? I also decided then that from that, it's beneficial to work on creating some different designs and differentiate my designs based on where they are. So right off the bat, I went with places that are more southerly are going to have they're going to have more of this thatch. Maybe they get a little bit less water, and so it's a more beneficial thing. I will have to do some research on, thatch roofing and see what that yields, because to be honest, at this point, I don't know a whole lot. And that's one of the wonderful things about world building is you learn so much more about your own world. Like, you can't start working on building out worlds without having to do some amount of research on, reality. And I find that to be a really wonderful aspect, and is just something that has been a boon for me, something that I have benefited from personally because of my own world building. This is something that's come up at my writing group a couple times where, I have one friend that works with us there who's working on some Civil War fiction. And in that, they will often have to research, when was this thing invented? Did this thing exist at this point in time? And so they're often learning so much about our world and how our world is built just from the things that they have to, by necessity, research. And I think that is such a wonderful benefit. So anytime you're world building, you're naturally going to do research on the world around you, and it will inform your knowledge. Simultaneously, it's interesting to see what knowledge you have as an individual that just naturally finds its way in. I have raised livestock and have had really big gardens at several different points in my life, and it was one of those things that I really enjoyed about spending time with my grandfather, because he had this massive garden growing up. And so I am always thinking about food, because I like to eat, big shock there. But also I'm thinking about how the food is accumulated, how it's grown, how people are storing it, and those kinds of things. So I think about how the paddocks would have to be for the cattle or for the sheep. I think about the spaces and how they would be used for the chickens. And those kinds of things inform how I think about the cities and towns and stuff that I'm building. And this is a, esoteric thing for me in particular, but you have something like this too. I'd love to hear about that in the comments. Like, what are some unique things about your life that come up in your world building, or might? If you live in cities, which I never have, I've never lived in a big city, you are going to have different perspectives on things than I do. If you have a job that necessitates working in, just a field that I am not aware of, then the things that are occurring to you when you world build are necessarily going to be different. And again, I live in the United States. I live in Colorado, which is a place that frequently has pretty intense, crazy weather. And, there's no month of the year here except for maybe July where we can't get snow. And sometimes that snow is just in the mountains, but sometimes it happens other places. We've had, snow days when I was teaching in May, and we've had snow on June 1st before. And, most years the coldest time of year is February, March. But there's certainly been a lot of times, even this last season, where there was really cold -degree days that were, really early in the season. That's not common. Part of Colorado weather is just it doesn't follow any any order. It can be anything. I found that in Iceland and in Colorado, they have the same saying, which is if you don't like the weather, just wait 5 minutes for it to change. And there seems to be a lot of truth with that. So that informs how I think about things. I think about things naturally from the world that I live in. Now, I also grew up for a time in California and in England, and so I've got some differing perspectives there, and that's beneficial. I find that the regions that I build and the people groups that I build often fit into places that I've been. You know, the antagonists of this novel basically exist in a place that is a merger of the Highlands in Scotland and our Highlands here in Colorado, and then a little bit of, Icelandic culture. You don't always have to create from the things that you've experienced, but I do find that when you create cultures based on the real world, you're naturally going to imbibe of some accuracy. You're going to find things that you wouldn't have necessarily planned for that are just going to take care of themselves. If you model your society after medieval England, you're naturally going to work in the stonework. You're going to work in some of their dietary things. You might have some of the peasant culture. And those kinds of things are naturally going to make your world a little bit more rich. And largely what I'm doing here today, though, is I have that initial idea, and now I'm working on riffing off of it. So how can I create different ideas that are all still authentic to that, but might develop in conjunction with it? So, like I mentioned earlier, I've got this main capital city of Elaine. Let's assume for the moment that it has always been the capital, that it's where the people who founded this country settled. And so it's, kind of the benchmark for everything. Now, they have access to a little bit more wood there because they have, more wealth, which means that the other cultures that are like subcultures and the other towns and cities would probably try to mimic that as best they could. Some would outright reject it. So if wood is a precious resource that not everybody can get, they would probably take it to just use in the areas where it was necessary. So I'm thinking that for a lot of these structures, they're using wood for probably the door frames and for central posts in the house. Maybe they can't get metal that will do that. Glass is being imported, metal is being imported, but it's not particularly difficult to import. And, I was talking to a friend, and one of the ideas that we came up with, rather that he came up with, was maybe, because wood is such a rarity, that when every house is kind of christened and, you have the ceremony for that it's the wood of the door frame that is the last thing that's put on, and it's a celebration. And I don't have a term for that, but it would be easy to come up with some kind of, door frame celebration or something that ties into that aspect, which is a cultural phenomenon for them because wood is such a rare commodity. So that's the kind of blanket. This is this culture and some of the pieces that I've devised for how they operate. So given that, what can we riff off of? Well, we started last time with the differing window shapes. I'm trying now to just experiment with different kinds of structural shape and how that might inform things. And like I mentioned, I'm doing this without thinking too much. Though over here I've got a silo because I was, thinking, well, you're going to have silage and going to have areas to hold it. And round structures seem to do really, really well with extreme weather. So, which of course gave rise to this design here, which is more like a hobbit hole, but the idea that this should be thatch as well. Yeah. But, having a totally rounded structure doesn't seem like a bad idea either. And that might be maybe in one region, they've started to go that way because it's easier to build. Maybe the triangular was the ideal, but eventually that became something that is not done everywhere because it's, too expensive or too difficult to do. It's funny because like we as humans will do things a lot of the time because we think it's normal or it's got some nostalgia or prestige adjacent to it. I think about here in Colorado where lawns make basically 0 cents and yet everyone still has one. They consume tremendous amounts of water and they're just highly illogical. If you don't water your lawn for a couple weeks here in Colorado, it's toast. It'll just die. But that's because this is not an area where lawns would naturally exist. I have a lot of family that lives in Ohio, and that's you want to have a lawn that just takes care of itself. Go to Ohio. They don't require much maintenance. You plant things in the ground, and they just stay. They just grow. If you quit mowing your backyard, you will have a forest in several years, and that is just crazy to think of from my perspective because I live in a place where everything has to be tended so meticulously or it just dies. And that is something that, comes into the world building, something that has to be thought about. But these people are probably living in an area where things grow reasonably well. And yeah, sorry, I have a tendency to distract myself with things and then I ramble and then I'm like, I don't remember where I was going before that. But yeah, the big point I wanted to talk about today is simply the fact that varying your motif, working off of the basic idea that you've got, and just seeing how that might vary naturally as human, is a really good way to just add some layers of authenticity to your world building. And the secondary component here is that I started with the idea of the culture. This is a group of people who live in this kind of area, they do this kind of things, they have access to these kinds of animals. But you don't have to start there. You could start with a logo design, a symbol for your people. And likewise, you don't have to have one. You just have to have some overarching idea that allows you to start moving forward. I often start with the region. I don't know why, but maybe it's just that that's how I like world building. I like thinking about, well, these people live in the desert. How can I make the desert more interesting? What are the struggles of a desert? Water. How can I make a fantastic or fantastical kind of intriguing way for them to handle the water issues? And then I go forward. But I've also started before with, this is a culture that has a lot of magic. Well, how would that inform where they live, how they exist? But you could start with anything. This is a group of people who their entire life is based on giant lizards. Their entire life is based on their interactions with dragons. They live on the coast and they handle nothing but trade. They have long since stopped growing anything of their own. They just handle import and distribution. Anything like that is going to be a motif that allows you some design parameters. And I would encourage you, that's where I would start, is just a motif. It doesn't matter. Can be a symbol, can be the animals they use, can be the weapons they use, can be the kind of magic they use, can be like I do, which is where they live. It does not seem to matter. That's another thing I would love to hear from you. If you are sitting down and building a group of people, a civilization, a country, what is it that informs that? Or is it simply like I designed this, because it's in my book and now I have to, back that up? I would love to hear from you because this is, unlike art in general, this is not an area where I've had a ton of people to talk to about processes over the years. So it's something that I've done for a long time. I certainly consume a lot of content based on world building stuff, but I don't have the backlog of people, human interactions with people who are also working on their own world building. So I would very, very much love to hear from you. And if you are interested, we've got a Discord server attached to this channel as well that has some, areas. It's not primarily world building. It's primarily just art. But if you're here, I would assume that you probably do a little bit of both. And so if you want to check that out, it's in the description down below. I would encourage you to check out our little art community. It is pretty small, and what that means is that it tends to be kind of intimate. If you want feedback on things, but you're fearful or scared of being in too public of a position for that, it will serve you well in that capacity. So wherever it is that you start, it seems like it's probably best just to have an idea. And now, of course, as I'm talking and rambling about this, I'm really curious why it is that I choose to go by region. I want to say that I think it's more logical, but that's why I need your feedback, because I'm not sure if it is logical or if it's just logical to me. The big regions in my world is I have this, country that's kind of on the plains. And I keep saying country. I don't really know if it's country or nation. I don't really know. They're mostly, I think, kind of like city states where there's councils held and they come together. But they're not all the same either. But this is Malaine, and they are a group of people who live on the plains, as we've talked about. And, if we're going to do circular windows, we should do an arched door, not a circle door, because then it's just straight up a hobbit house. Then we've got Karak, which is the folk that live in the mountains, and they are kind of the antagonistic people group, and probably also my favorite, which probably tells you something. And then we have the folk that live in the desert, and the desert is called the Aura Desert, and their capital city is Oris Rock, and it's just the city under a gigantic rock that collects the dew in the morning and then drains the water into these massive vats in the underground, and I think it's really cool. We've got a group of elemental beings that live in a volcano in the melting city, which is a really fun thing to draw. And I know these are like super, super simple pine trees. I'm thinking about this because I'm going to be doing a video here soon on like how to draw pine trees. And it's like, yeah, I'm exemplifying that really well right now. It's not the point. I'm just trying to get basic ideas down. It also makes me wonder, like, can I do trees like, trees on top? I don't know. Might be kind of an intriguing idea to play with. So, but yeah, that's the Fellards, and they live in these, they live in highly elemental areas. I've got a group of almost like mer people, kind of like the Zora from Zelda, called the Lair Ladanios, and they live in the ocean, obviously, but they are not going to feature very strongly in the books that I'm working on right now. They'll feature strongly in another one. We have two species of sprite that live in two very different giant forests. One is a giant forest like the stuff in Northern California, where you get the redwoods, and I think they're sequoias as well. And so just gigantic columnar trees. And then that's Hayuku. And then Tsunauchi is the southern forest, and it's just like a tangle. Very similar to Fangorn in Lord of the Rings, but just much, much, much. Actually, if you think about it, one is kind of like Lothlorien, and one of them's like Fangorn. Didn't intend that, but it does make sense with my background in fantasy. So one is a forest of columnar trees, one is a forest of tangled trees, but there's a gigantic, almost Yggdrasil. In fact, Sora and Auroch, the two giant trees there, are actually children of the world tree, because can you really have a fantasy world without a world tree or dragons? I mean, maybe you could, but like, why? It's too much fun. So, and then we've got a group of hobbit people, not really hobbit people, but they're humans, that they live in hobbit-like areas that I have done no work about. I just know where they are on the map. And that happens a lot too, where I will, work with, the stuff that's occurred to me naturally over the years, and then I will be like, oh yeah, like we need another region over here. There is a race of people that are probably pseudo-humans who live in an area called the Canyonlands, and they don't speak. They're kind of an almost tribalistic people. They wear masks. They're very tall, and they don't speak at all, and they live in hollowed out areas inside of the Canyonlands. And what else? Oh, we've got the Senesians, which are people that live in the far south, in like Arctic areas, and I'll actually have to be writing about them pretty soon. But they're again just human. There's a lot of just normal humans in my world, which I don't know. I like the other races. They're fun, but I just haven't done a ton of stuff with them. I think I felt like originally when I started putting things together that I didn't want to have just elves and dwarves because that's what everybody had. And I also didn't want to lean heavily on all the fantasy races. I wanted it to be a primarily human story because I'm human. And so the other races, at least in the novel I'm working on, are not as prominently featured, but they will be very prominently featured in some of the other texts and such that I've started working on, but just haven't done a ton of work on yet. So as I'm doing these, I'm also thinking, like, what if you had one of these that use no wood? Like, what if this one right here, it's all stone? Like, they don't have access to any wood, or they just don't use wood. And so maybe, they're stone shapers. Trying to think. Oh, I've got the city on the delta, which is Shoal City, and it's a series of cities that are right on the delta. And yeah, those ones will be fun to play with eventually. And I'm sure I'm forgetting some others right now because the world's pretty big, but most of what I'm doing is just focused on a singular continent at this moment. So, but I'm gonna kind of wrap this up soon, I think. The blanket idea I had for this session essentially was riffing on a motif, and so that's what I've been trying to work on with these 4 additional homes here is just we've got a basic idea what happens if we just continue to kind of mess with that. So I hope you've been doing the same. I hope as you're listening, you are thinking about cool ideas that you can work on and the kind of stuff that inspires you. As always, I would love to hear about it in the comments below to know what's exciting. And if you have any questions, things that you want me to chew on or talk about or, nonsensically ramble about in one of the future sessions, just let me know. It's so much more fun to actually get to talk to and respond to questions because it feels like instead of talking to the aether, I am talking to actual human beings. Imagine that. So, anyway, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I'm glad, especially if you're here at the end. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out my Patreon, feel free to do so. It's linked down in the description below next to the Discord link, which I would also encourage you to check out. Next time, who knows? Who knows what we'll do next time? Will we keep playing with these? I don't know. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.